Clearing Trauma from Discrimination, Episode 6, The Longing is Over. Karakia. Tā tai tuarangi Māori, whenua Māori, tinana, manawa, henangaro, wairua Māori, rongoa Māori, ahau Māori, tūturu o whiti, whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e, tai ki e. No mai haramai, my name is Sienna Raymond. Welcome to the last episode of this long read from this season. Please forgive my delay in getting this episode out to you. Racism is very hard to write about, firstly because of the hatred and denial that comes the way of the one telling the hurtful secrets hiding in the community. We all know that anyone who outs behaviours which hold no value other than tolerance and nothing one can do is like outing alcoholism, sexual abuse and rape in the 1970s. These exposures are met with fierce threats of violence and alienation and, of course, abuse. Loads of abuse. Full-on abuse. Non-stop abuse. The best kind of abuse that our country has to offer. And as I have lived with being abused my entire life for outing behaviours unacceptable by my judgment, the abuse is nothing new, nor really shocking. I have been threatened with everything but a nuclear missile in my eyes. The second reason is I don't like sharing the pain it causes because I know somewhere someone out there in the public domain is rubbing their hands and licking their lips and smacking their chops together in glee at the knowledge of racism causing distress, troubled child harassment, pain, grief, and the outcome, long-suffering trauma. Racism and discrimination hurt badly and very deeply, but the colonisation and westernisation are unbelievably worse. The hurts from the pain run deep into every part of a being who is experiencing this process. The fire which burns from that horror bomb assimilation in Indigenous interiors is like lava frying away the insides. My parents did well to hide the pain and grief, but losing feelings and emotions is one way to survive it. Also living and being the destruction, at the time, destroying, but later on, when the healing is underway, the recognition of that destruction is appreciated. To show the depth of deprivation an Indigenous human will fall to when colonised, westernised, Europeanised, materialised, and it is all false for them. For many, colonisation turns Indigenous people into monsters. Assimilation does the same with much more regrettable outcomes. It's much harder to de-assimilate, whereas colonisation is an ongoing process. I think of myself as a recovering colonised child. There is no choice, only helplessness. The unsupported Indigenous realm within the construct of westernisation, European imperialism, has long-lasting negative effects. Shame and guilt, cigarettes and alcohol are some of the tools of the assimilators, and shame is unbearable at the level of its use on the colonised child, who cannot stand up straight and grow clean under the weight of, you are useless, worthless, unworthy, not wanted, not equal, nor will you ever be. Learn your place. White is privileged, and Indigenous is only tolerated for 50 years per person. Then you must die, because you are only recognised for your manuality, workability, to be trained. Neediness is punishable by illness, no life quality, and diminishment of spirit, intelligence, initiative, and soul. I get these are very hard terms and opinions for me to make, and they are my lived experience, if not overtly, at the most covertly put out into the ethers. If these kaupapa weren't real, I'd never be putting these traumas down on paper. These traumas can't be made up, and they don't disappear with time, ever. What does it mean the longing is over, and what is longing? When I first started this countdown to episode 6, starting this podcast, long reads landed me in a patch of words, sentences, and paragraphs that meld together and give meaning to a troubled colonisation experience, and even more so, a hated colonised child. The longing is a strange converse and a difficult sense of being to describe, and getting into description would take us down a worthless, sharp-edged piece of coal rabbit hole of westernization and assimilation. And as these bearings and wearings of social constructs cannot be understood so well by a non-colonized child, I will attempt not to do that, to describe what the longing is, but instead infuse it in the wordage that follows. Bizarre as it may seem that in New Zealand or Aotearoa, as we are grateful to be known by today as well as New Zealand, I think of longing as consumption and the chill to experience commodification, here a motor vehicle, and or house and property, but most of all the identification to be in equal true partnership, but about striving for the success of equality. This is a false statement. It isn't equality I'm striving for. It is the inner calling for the release from the real pain and grief, let alone the confusion of being melted by the torments of being Europeanized against my knowledge and freedom to choose. These statements might address as being unreasonable, yet I have covered this very content in previous episodes, that the right and choice being absent and the supplication to the will of white Europeanism does not qualify me for equality and safe entitlement into the Western collective material path. No, it doesn't. It does not. No matter how painfully I push away and push down the ethnicity and culture, that I walk in a world where we are nothing and racism is nestled deep in the hearts of many who live in Aotearoa. It is the highest of highs. The colonized child is forever in danger and never safe, ever. We are never thought of at all as having access to resources or access to communities or access to bureaucracy and governments and politics and policies and money, when in a young 30-year-old body these are old people's terms, till maturity and the societal highs and lows have whipped the colonized child to shreds. Does the awakening to not feeling and being welcome, of working in workplaces where the stigma of being Māori rolls off the furniture and auras in the environment, reaching out to the colonized child with the intention to suffocate me? The energy of not being welcome has increased in the last 10 years from my experience, and I'm being colonized of late by new colonizers. But back to the longing, in the way a colonized child thinks of longing. To belong, to their country. This statement could come across as a very bizarre, even bizarrer concept, to be like everyone else. Longing, when you're in it, when you're in the thick of it, there is no way you ever think you're not equal and will soon taste the oyster. Access to the best of what life has to offer. See the world, climb Mount Everest, and row the Amazon. It is odd to have that when the colonised child would do anything to know their awa and moana, walk at the foot of their maunga, and know the legends of their own people. The modern use of longing by the markets for internal and external needs are a lure or a hook to the railway line of eternal happiness. To get all of me into that belief, to get all of me into the belief that I can have just as much as everyone else, when I long to know the history of the iwi and marae I belong to, and struggle with that access. This is the way of the Western world, when the colonised child must live in the city and belong to its collective materialism. I must be Europeanized, to not show any markings or attributes of my cultural heritage, washing myself in the river of my culture and returning to the material world is another waiting hidden trauma. This is a truth in the land of milk and honey. Longing of any kind is neediness, and thus punishable. Recognised, or at least until I was much older in my maturity, my 30s, 40s and 50s continued on with striving after the unachievable, and my reward was stupidity, the wasted time and effort of falling into glamour. It would have been easier for me to work and save and be a non-entity, as the wise ones before me said. Keep your head down and keep working, rather than trying to stand out in the crowd with fancy. This one, as a colonised child, was turned inside out and upside down, and found myself hungry for thirsting of gaining loss, without knowing this was what I was doing all along. Ignorant? Yes, very much so. And a lot of longing for regaining, building on false dreams and losing to regain sadness over madness. The longing process is a brilliant mechanism. To the colonised child, it is a scary, gigantic vortex, and sadness to madness. It is what the colonised child achieves. Yes, we have made remarkable gains with Te Reo Māori, being as acceptable as white European tolerance levels fluctuate. But the damage from years of colonisation, which I equate to abuse of my indigenuity, the trauma remains. It doesn't magically disappear. The shadow still needs to be investigated and the trauma excavated for my being, for the healing to begin and remain intact till I die. To start with, as a colonised child who is tormented by not being acceptably white, this is the dilemma of westernisation and Europeanising non-white children born to Māori. I don't start with longing, I start with scraping and scratching. Longing only came to me once I was fully active in the public domain. It was only available to me once I was fast asleep in the dream of my false identity. That false self is the white European brown-skinned female consumed by the gaping hole that is her existence, trampled by the vacuum of desperation, to not be recognised or noticeable as an Indigenous woman. Indigenous gets in the way of upwardly mobile. Indigenous has been and continues to be highlighted poorly in the public eye since Cook's first contact, and as long as I have lived and breathed. The besetters are many and lived by newspapers in the earlier days before television and the internet, then by every kind of media outlet available for human consumption. Therefore, to lower the percentage of gold or the good, the flourishing, the best of what it means to be Indigenous, making it unconsumable, distasteful, and disgusting. This is a thing I am unaware of till education, and especially mātauranga Māori. Had people recognised racism as a legitimate harm, a real legitimate harm, as we have done for the likes of alcohol, cigarettes, drunk driving, non-consensual sex, and equal rights of the individual, let alone freedom of speech toward hatred, who gets better recognition than Indigenous people being murdered and lost and taken and stolen and killed right in front of us in broad daylight? Who decides damnation? Who categorises and rates the highs and lows of human beings? Of the craziness that other causes are way ahead of racism recognition, that becomes an ordeal to suffocate in. I remember going home or coming home from school and addressing racism with my mum from primary school, and I would have been in stand 4 telling her about my concerns of being called derogatory names from primers to the now of that time. Mum would say that it was just name-calling and ignore them. Don't pay them any mind. So by the time I got to college, in the 3rd form, I was no longer convinced that it was just name-calling. The first thing I noticed at college in the 3rd form, when I first got to meet all my new classmates, was a much bigger draw to pull from. There were more Māori at college because our college was a funnel for at least 10 to 12 intermediate schools. So that was a lot for that area. And I remember talking with my new friends, you know how it is, and I'm hearing the same stuff that I experienced. You're a nigger, you stink blackie, you dirty Māori, chocolate like it's something disgusting, which attacked the sense of beautiful selfhood, implying one who is brown is ugly. We were all living through the same horrors as vulnerable teens in a foreign world that was our own homeland. And each one of us was dealing with this according to our personalities, background, and whānau connection, but not at all from a traditional path insofar as having something to hold on to when the gales of white derogatory shaming us storms hit hard. I wished they'd had a weather forecast for that. The young struggle is real, powerful, frightening, awesome, and debilitatingly long, hence longing. How long do I keep? What is my shelf life permanent in an impermanent existence? Till expiry dates appear on food. This is the only method of capture, like a melting pot gone wrong. I'd say to my mum that something is off here and we need to pay attention to it. I wanted to write poetry and essays on racism, but my generation never really sat and talked to our parents. I didn't have private discussions as such. We all talked at the table during kai. Outside of that space, I might have come across as moaning and nagging, as my older sister would call me, a broken record. My parents wouldn't have foreseen the trouble on the horizon. It wasn't part of their experience as such. They too were being colonised and assimilated, and in pain, grief, confusion, hope, despair, laughter and excitement, leaving the country life for the city. It's all new and the chances are bountiful. Yes, it's It's all fun and games till someone starts to cry. I believe if my mother knew that the name-calling would turn into coal for us, she might have spoken up on our behalf. In my coming to terms with my longing, my trouble was I had a greater sense of my entitlement to fairness and better treatment. I was stepping out of line and trying to tell her, "Hey Mum, we need to do something about this name-calling. There's something horrible going on, and I'm worried that it'll all get worse and not better. It isn't just me imagining this stuff. All my other Māori friends at college have the same thing happening to them. I've been telling you this forever. Nothing has changed." And in the tenor and tone of name-calling from the kids and teachers, negative focus on brown kids is even higher. It was more. It was a lot at primary school, and it was more at intermediate. But by the time we got to college, it had escalated 100%. The warning signs were all there. I'm not anybody political. I wasn't anything major. I was not a brilliant academic kid, but I wasn't stupid. There were many of us talking about name-calling and stigmatization. But you get home and the parents, it's not that they're useless. It is simply that they are not trained and skilled to know what racism is, because we didn't know what it was either. This new thing called colonisation, which to my understanding our tupuna wasn't aware that the British Empire had actually been involved in colonisation for centuries and learnt it from the Romans, who were dominated by pyramids in their dreams. The majority of white European New Zealanders that we went to school with were very intolerant of other cultures, and this was and still is a great failing of our societies, because it has serious repercussions on a mono-based facing society that doesn't teach us about ourselves and each other. Harder still, the longing to know one's true identity as a Māori exists in a turmoil of agony. Racism is a hot seat in our country, and at present Māori occupy that hot seat along with possibly Muslim and Asian. If Māori are extinguished, then that hot seat doesn't go away, it remains, and will simply just replace us with another culture, as this is the nature of racism. It is the nature of this beast that grows in our society now, that has long roots, entwined around and twirl around and twisted around every single fibre of our beings, and it's inescapable as a result of having a mono-society that has had dominance, and it's hurting all of us who are discriminated against because of it. Does wisdom that has created discrimination, this wisdom, is it truly that, or is it a gladness of being? That one can only be elevated by the destruction of ethnicity and indigenuity, till industry and technology offer other options to replace them. The long-held habit of name-calling doesn't stop when Māori are extinguished. Name-calling, as said earlier, kept going and growing and growing, till we have a very racist country today. The burden of being called derogatory names that refer to my skin colour, race and culture as being less than human and equal to, if not, and depending on who's labelling me, as a speck of dust or a lower class animal, turns the whole commitment of being colonised into excrement. And I don't say that colonisation is any better than communism or fascism or religion or any of the other isms and the theory, let's go back to full-on tribalism. No, because nothing but nothing can save me from my indigenuity in this fast-growing technological world, which is also heading, and I had no idea of this awaiting danger, and more to come on awaiting hidden dangers for the colonised child. I had no idea that I'd be through my westernisation and assimilation contributing to Papua Nuku's demise via global warming within the container of the climate crisis. But the death to all goodness hope for a wonderful society in the future of my youth is not so much the names being called, that it becomes a horror story when one realizes the hurt being attributed to me is from human beings I will have to share any society with. Herein is longing. I had to push down any and all growing concerns I had of white European New Zealand children, youths and teenagers I was sharing school and my community with, because who really trusts anyone who calls a Māori a dirty, stinky blackie? And who trusts anyone with the power to diminish a person through the colour of their skin, race and culture, especially if that race and culture are deemed no longer to exist, as I was repeatedly told by the white European New Zealanders I went to school with, especially if they believe the names they were calling me are justified. Longing is having to push down and push away the distrust of white European New Zealanders, while I push down and push away the indigenuity and ethnicity of my being. I live to accept discrimination. This is all my life is worth on this planet. Show I accept it, be the acceptance of discrimination, and I longed to be white. I longed to be white for it. My first cousin is blonde and blue-eyed. Her heritage is also English. Her dad was blonde and blue-eyed. Not that there is anything wrong with that. But when next to my first cousin whom I love, I felt self-conscious, and while she was hot, I was a Māori, full stop. We had our fights, and at the time neither of us would have associated any ill feelings towards one another as possibly having their roots in racism, in the sense of her privilege and my discrimination. But to be clear, she would have had her issues with colour and race to deal with at school when her family lived in South Auckland before they moved back to Northland. Half-castes were as bright as my first cousin, who as well as being blonde and blue-eyed, had white skin colouring. But that never held her back, nor us, from developing our own unique relationships, given these differences. And neither of us would know the implications. At least I wouldn't till I was older and till my maturity, to name the knowing of this is why she got a Māori boyfriend and I got a white European New Zealand husband. She was South Auckland, where Brown dominated, and me, the East Side, where European dominated. To excite the matter, my first cousin never suffered from derogatory name-calling at school is not the truth, because she would have, even if I'd not heard it myself. The names would have been different to point out her advancement over the children who were clearly more ethnic than my first cousin. Though we are from the same whānau and the same age, relating to a point stop there, it would be okay for her to marry a Māori, but with my experience, not for me. This is the better part of the delusion of my shame, of being a young Māori woman dying up in the city. I learnt it well, and it cost me more than I could pay, but eventually I do. The name callers looked very much like my first cousin, blonde, blue-eyed, with fair sun-kissed skin. It was rare to be racially harassed by white European New Zealanders with dark colouring. That model is very hard to break free from. But I try anyway to keep pushing away the distrust that is growing and mounting within and without. The discrimination will finally become too hard to ignore. We fight for land and country. We fight for land, for freedom, for equality. And we are left with a two-edged sword which cuts and slices both ways. This is the inescapable madness of colonisation and of being the colonised child. It is kin to wandering around in the wilderness, lost and yet found, clearly aware of one's surroundings, but lost to the magnitude of the scope and scale of the trees and greenery. Yet all of it is familiar and not. After all, how could it be truly familiar when I never had the same access to it that my fellow white European New Zealanders have and do? So, can I know to navigate the body, mind and spirit's safety? Through this which causes me more harm than good, I will end up doing more harm to Papatūānuku, as rain in places where humans don't live eventually becomes known through the crisis it causes people, when out of sight, out of mind, careens down the wilderness and destroys, as did Cyclone Gabrielle. That which it is forward with the presence of force this form of nature holds, then I can see the harm and effects of colonisation over the course of my life filled with racism. It is daft to compare a cyclone to colonisation. Still, I understood it even though I wasn't directly affected by the cyclone. I knew it as the hidden, unseen danger, where life rolls by and we can live and have no fears. As the sword swipes me in half, that my parents fought for ancestral lands, their generation stronger in numbers and more willing to cooperate, as colonisation separates and divides because we individuate exponentially with each turn of the wheel to grow, te ara, the way. We can no longer come together easily as extended whānau, even with the history of growing up together. I, because I find myself in the city, and there are many because for this colonised child. The names and numbers stretch out in my inner world, where there is only enough room for so little. And I still carry the genes from 5 generations back. That would be into the late 1700s. These genes are not adapted in the same way for white European New Zealanders. The white Europeans gave up tribalism over 1,000 years ago. They have been living in towns and cities for many generations and adapting their genes to wheat and dairy and everything else Western for an age and more. My mum had issues with sugar, as did her mum. However, my great-grandmother, it was reported to me by mum, my great-grandmother didn't have any sugar or cholesterol issues. She faced health problems related to colds and influenza. The village tribal landscape had been disintegrating since Cook's first contact. Detriments and very early signs of mental health and well-being could have begun their emergence because of loss of cultural identity and lands. And upon this subject I fall as a hapless victim doth fall on the sword's blade in battle, without the battle ever raging in the atmosphere. I didn't plan for my life to turn the way it has, nor had I seen the outcomes of many a decision I made in my life, particularly during the time of my great sleep to being a colonised child. I thought the myth of my doing well would go on forever, but it turned into a mist that pretty much obscured my way. I had made decisions under the pretext that I was equal to my fellow white European New Zealanders, and I wasn't, nor ever will be. My first cousin and her siblings, with their strong white European English New Zealand genes, never complained of sugar issues or cholesterol problems, heart, puku, skin, arthritis, osteoarthritis. In fact, the older sibling of that family, has the strongest constitution for alcohol that I've ever known. When those of her counterparts have long since had to forego the pleasure of a tipple, their older sibling has been able to stay long at the table into her senior years. Though alcohol is not the problem, the effects thereof and the character it creates could very well be the main concern. And it shows how the mystery of genetics operates for one whānau in their guaranteed survival and possible flourishing, and the demise of the Western collective material path of destruction for mine. I believe this is very severe of me to say. What is more severe is adjusting myself to live in the knowledge of my genes and hear my voice at the correction of decisions made that will guide me better till my last breath in this lifetime. I know, for example, I had said in a previous episode relating to identity with KFC and the cosmetics of the Colonel, a very southern gentleman who could easily have come from a slave owner heritage, and hence my aversion to eating KFC. When in this episode I am taking KFC further to the lead of genes and genetics, and the absence of genes that would help me. Processes food in all its ingredients safely for my body's sake. The white European Western collective spans many more lifetimes of this compilation of Western societies and the like. They've adapted long into the varieties and have hardier systems, or at least genes that can even strive them past fusion diets into the many varied forms of foods and forms available on this planet. Whereby my singular experience hinges on the experience, capacity and capability of my parents and their parents living the Western collective material path. Me personally, I look to the 5th generation back, and yes, I'm not only guessing and hypothesizing, I'm making a far-reaching grab at something to explain away the health and safety issues and concerns. Remember the hidden dangers awaiting the colonized child. Do I envy my cousins? After a lifetime of terrible health and mental care, yes. And do I celebrate them? That's a complex one, because it rides on whether my cousins know they have the privilege and good genes to flourish on the Western collective material path. And again, I must deal with longing and the filling up of propaganda about Māori health and well-being. Or is it propaganda? Either way, not the role of the colonised child to address. Instead, the release and relinquishment of my Western vulnerability are key to being freed from longing. A burden for the colonised child carrying what isn't its own to carry. The forced indoctrination to keep up the false standard and destroy oneself for it and of it. What is remarkable about New Zealand's remarkability? What is our whole heritage and goal? That which we show to the world, that we put out there on the world stage as being clean green, as being that which can be upheld as the best, when really we actually have a lot of shadow and unsaid harm to ourselves through poor guidance from our political leaders of once, long ago, and up to now, except for matriarchy, who has expected the utmost assimilation from our people. Assimilation is ultra painful. It isn't a skip through a field of yellow flowers, when so many of us have to carry racial hatred put onto us from an ongoing pattern that sounds out in the solar system, pinging off everything and anything that moves. The shame of our white New Zealand European country people, knowing the colonised child out in public is in pain, is intolerably held in place by longing. When I mingle with you in the workplace, stand in line with you at the checkout, swim, walk, run, play, and be in this country with you, knowing that I am a shameful, worthless beast. This is longing, and this is what is over when the longing is held in the right places of the Indigenous heart. This organ of great firing can take this longing and burn its harmful properties for the colonised child to regain their true sense of selfhood. What is given to the colonised child from that burn is discernment, wisdom fashioned from the great love of this vessel. Thank you once again for joining me for this episode, the last in this season. It is my true hope you clear the trauma from discrimination within the field of all your experience in being in this world. Kia tau te rangi mari e. Let there be peace. Sienna Raymond.